The court is now in session. Today, the judges will read the court's verdicts for each case and announce the sentences for each of the defendants along with a brief explanation. A more detailed explanation for the tribunal's reasoning will be shared in written form sometime in the near future. We start with the case of Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering was tried on all 4 counts. Because the defendant admitted that he believed his role as plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan was to, within 4 years, put the entire economy in a state of readiness for war, and because of the prosecution's evidence regarding his involvement and intention of building the Luftwaffe up to wage aggressive war, the tribunal finds the defendant, Hermann Goering, guilty on count 1, conspiracy or the common plan. Given that the defendant admitted to breaking the Treaty of Versailles by building an air force that the tribunal found to be hostile, the prosecution's additional evidence of the defendant taking control over and helping seize occupied territories, as well as his presence at many high-level meetings like the Hossbach Conference, the tribunal finds the defendant, Hermann Goering, guilty on count 2, crimes against the peace. My fellow presiding justice, Justice Stein, will now read the verdicts for counts 3 and 4.
Thank you, Chief Justice Rosenau. The tribunal finds the defendant, Hermann Goering, guilty of Indictment 3 war crimes. Mr. Goering clearly violated the Hague and Geneva Conventions when he took responsibility for all Gestapo murders, ordered destructive air raids by the Luftwaffe, was a part of the Germanization of occupied territories, and established concentration camps across Eastern Europe. The tribunal has also found Goering guilty of Indictment 4, crimes against humanity, seeing as he played an enormous role in the planning of the final solution. After close inspection of all of the facts presented by the prosecution and defense, the tribunal has sentenced Hermann Goering to death by hanging, seeing his crimes too atrocious to let him carry on in prison, let alone society.
Thank you, Justice Stein. Justice Hubbard will now read the verdict for the case of Franz von Papen.
We find the defendant, Franz von Papen, guilty of count 1, the common plan and conspiracy. The documents submitted and oral arguments presented before and during the trial led the tribunal to our decision. Though the ambiguity in the evidence caused much discussion, the evidence showed von Papen's signatures on important Nazi documents that allowed Hitler's rise to absolute power and allowed the annexation of Austria. Though this on its own does not make him guilty, his relationship with Hitler and his malicious intentions behind his actions made the tribunal decide that Franz von Papen is guilty of conspiracy in the common plan. His punishment for his actions will be 10 years in jail with no parole.
Thank you, Justice Hubbard. Justice Pinto will now read the verdict for the case of Julius Streicher.
We hereby find the defendant, Julius Streicher, guilty of conspiracy or the common plan. For conspiracy, Streicher proposes solutions for the Jewish question called the Madagascar Plan. Although this plan was not carried out, the process of planning such actions that could and would be acceptable to be charged under crimes against humanity is included under count 1. More importantly, Streicher's contribution to Der Stürmer was too large to go unnoticed. His harsh dialogue, such as, quote, "the Jew must die," end quote, promptly persuaded the public to take action in monstrous tasks against the Jews of Germany and Jews of occupied territories. We hereby find the defendant, Julius Streicher, guilty of crimes against humanity. Streicher's conspiring of the deportation of Jews was later turned into the relocation of said peoples to ghettos and the camps where they were enslaved, tortured, experimented on, and killed. These actions listed in Part A of Crimes Against Humanity lead to Part B, which states persecution, political, racial, and religious grounds in the execution of and in connection with the common plan mentioned in count 1. Furthermore, Streicher's harsh words and ideologies led the civilians' murderous actions, which, although he did not directly partake in, his role in pushing for these actions was major. Streicher also had been an active role in the Reichstag as well as the Nazi Party until 1945. The atrocities carried out by these groups are not insignificant, and he must be held accountable. As a result, Stretcher will be sentenced to life in prison.
Thank you.
The verdict for the IMT versus Carl Dunnett's case may now be presented. We hereby find the defendant, Carl Dunnett, not guilty of count 1, the common plan or conspiracy, as there is no recorded evidence of Dunnett attending meetings or conferences where conspiracy to commit crimes against the peace, common plan or conspiracy occurred or planning of aggressive war took place. However, based on the evidence provided by prosecution, the tribunal finds the defendant guilty of commanding and deploying the U-boats to wage aggressive war, as well as having full knowledge of and participating in Fall Weiss. Therefore, we find Carl Dunnett guilty of crimes against the peace.
The tribunal also finds the defendant, Carl Dunnett, guilty of war crimes. Dunnett gave direct orders that went against treaties and agreements, particularly the Hague Convention, which Germany had agreed to, that protected merchant and civilian vessels. Dunnett also admitted to knowing that an order he gave, the Laconia Order, was against the Hague Convention. And although it could be argued that not picking survivors was acceptable under some of the war conditions, there is evidence showing that U-boats did not signal to ships that they were going to fire to them. With this in mind, we sentenced Dunnett to 15 years in prison.
Thank you. The verdict for the IMT versus Hans Frank case may now be presented.
The tribunal finds the defendant, Hans Frank, not guilty of conspiracy. The prosecution had no substantial evidence on Frank conspiring or planning events during World War II. The prosecution also missed key evidence regarding Frank sending his executive to the Wannsee Conference, where they discussed the final solution. The defense directly addressed this insufficient amount of evidence in their closing speech, which persuaded our decision. Defense and the defendant made bold claims when being accused of deporting slaves and cutting calories for the citizens of Poland, but prosecution had the evidence to back the charges of ill treatment of civilian populations, deportation of civilians, and deportation of prisoners of war for slave labor. It was clear to us from the start that Hans Frank violated the Hague and Geneva Convention, so the tribunal pronounces defendant Hans Frank guilty of war crimes. Lastly, although defense had a great closing statement addressing the issues on hand, prosecution had intricate evidence to back up the charge of inhumane treatment of Polish civilians, especially Polish Jews. So the tribunal declares Hans Frank guilty of crimes against humanity. Even though we found Hans Frank not guilty of conspiracy, his atrocious, cold-blooded acts cannot be tolerated. The tribunal sentences defendant Hans Frank to death by hanging. Thank you.
Thank you. The verdict for the IMT versus Albert Speer case may now be presented.
The tribunal finds the defendant Albert Speer not guilty of conspiracy. Neither the testimony presented at trial nor the document book that the prosecution presented to the tribunal was sufficient to prove the defendant Albert Speer guilty of conspiracy. Based on the evidence provided by the prosecution and because Speer admitted to many incriminating acts, including brutal recruitment, deportation, and knowingly sending workers to their deaths, and because bears some responsibility for horrible conditions in his factories, the tribunal finds the defendant Albert Speer guilty of count 3 war crimes. Lastly, because he admitted during cross-examination to being at the Posen Conference, receiving workers from concentration camps, sending slackers to concentration camps, and selecting Russians in particular to work under harsh conditions, the tribunal finds the defendant guilty of crimes against humanity. Though we found Speer not guilty of conspiracy because he was complicit in crimes against humanity and admittedly guilty of war crimes, the tribunal sentences Albert Speer to 30 years in prison.
Chief Justice Mendelson will now deliver the closing speech.
Thank you. 6 million Jews, 5.7 million Soviet civilians, 270,000 disabled people, 15
100,000 homosexuals. The numbers add up to over 17 million, and the statistics seem as though they go on forever. Joseph Stalin, a man with plenty of blood on his hands, has been attributed with the following insight into humanity. A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. At the conclusion of World War II, the globe was overwhelmed with statistics of horror and death. The words death camp, Zyklon B, Auschwitz, and countless other unheard of terms became a part of our conversation. While Nuremberg's primary goal was to move civilians towards post-war clarity and justice, the impact the trials left behind is just as meaningful. Many ask, what did the Nuremberg trials do in terms of changing the way we look at international rules and regulations in today's society? The answer to this question is complicated, but the overarching goal of Nuremberg was to prevent these horrific statistics from being recreated again in the future. Following the tragic events of the Holocaust, many nations decided that the cruelty that occurred in the previous years was outrageously inhumane and not to be tolerated or accepted in any circumstance going forward. So, the Allies decided to set up the International Military Tribunal, or the IMT, and for the first time in history, leaders were actually being prosecuted for acts, some of which were not technically illegal in their country, but should have never happened, no matter what order they were behind. So, what is the legacy of the Nuremberg trials? Well, this milestone in the history of law introduced a deterrent for future criminals and a means of holding them accountable. It created a whole new way of thinking about human rights. Now, people were being protected no matter which side of an international border they were on. Ultimately, the Nuremberg precedent led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court, commonly known as the ICC. Tadeusz Pankowitz, a Roman Catholic survivor from the Krakow ghetto, who is recognized in Israel as righteous among the nations, stated, "These small examples are incontrovertible proof of what blind, organized hatred can lead to, and of just how low standards of human morality can fall." Without the trials, who knows if the ICC would have been established? Without the ICC, who knows how many more lives would have been lost, how many more families would have been separated, how many more genocides would have been swept under the rug, and how many more statistics would have been and would continue to be in our history books. In conclusion, we must be grateful every day for the impact that the trials have had on our lives and today's world. An interesting hurdle that has not yet been cleared is that the United States is not a part of the ICC. The fact that our country commonly acts as an independent third party to try and solve disputes between other nations before they become bigger issues puts the US in a uniquely dangerous position. The challenge with the US joining is that our citizens would constantly be accused by one party or another in an international argument. Whether or not our country should join the ICC continues to be an interesting discussion. Despite the fact that the US is not engaged, the ICC has had some success in prosecuting those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Still to this day, many believe that differences are what separate the world, as there continue to be genocides and murders. But it should be the exact opposite. For centuries, various societies have used differences and conspiracies among people to create one's universe of obligation, which leads to an in-group and an out-group, bringing along segregation and violence. But why does our world believe that this is okay? Differences among humanity are what should start relationships, bring about conversations, and expand our knowledge about life. As soon as we stop learning, we stop connecting. And that is a key factor on what separates humans from all other living things. Nuremberg has helped our world get to where it is now, but without a doubt, humanity as a whole still has a tremendous amount of learning to do. Lastly, as we close our week-long mock trials, I would like to thank everyone who participated in the trials. To my fellow classmates, thank you for putting in hours on end going through the emotional journey of learning about the history and psychology of the Holocaust to prepare for this week. Learning about this history is not easy, but I can truly say that I've never seen better teamwork in all my 12 years at our school. To our teachers, Ms. Dorr, Mr. Cruz, and Dr. June, I do not know how we would have managed this class and the trials without your support. This class has been such an unforgettable gift of knowledge, as you are all true leaders and educators, and for that, I and the rest of my peers are grateful. Additionally, in this unique year, I would like to thank Mr. Simon for bringing us all together virtually from countless locations. We are all so grateful that you have been able to make the trials happen in these difficult circumstances. Furthermore, although I wouldn't trade it for the world, this class definitely lived up to the hardest class at Latin reputation. So thank you to all of the parents for supporting us through some of those stressful essay is due at midnight and it's 11:59 moments. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for clicking the links throughout the week. Although we are not in the courthouse today, we hope that the importance of Nuremberg shined through in our simulation and you all take home a new perspective on the Holocaust and the trials. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Court is adjourned. Thank you, Emily. That was a perfect speech. Thanks for coming.